we live in a world where wars may be local, but the impact is global, and we very much felt it.
Hey there, my friend. You're listening to the Hot Mess Hotline, and this is Stephanie Crevens. You are totally in the right place if you are an ambitious leader who wants to pull off a big transformational project. In the past, we would have called transformation change management, but I just don't think that change management is enough anymore. We need something more nuanced for the rest of the 21st century that can keep up with the rate of change that we're seeing. And that's what we have for you here on the Hot Mess Hotline. We teach you how to lead by combining strategy, innovation, flexibility, and focus for new business results, tough decisions, and so much more. Whatever you're working on, we have hard-earned lessons from executives to make you more adaptable, and you can take these lessons and put them into practice as soon as this episode is over. Today's guest is Alexei Miller. He is a member of a group of founders that has worked at DataArt since day one. He sees himself as a company builder, not a CEO, not a manager. He cares so deeply about his people and everything that's going on, so much to the point where when they did some surveys with DataArt employees, they've got 95% of 5,700 plus professionals who would recommend them as an employer to their colleagues. And they have 95% return rate of their clients. They are doing amazing things around the globe with technology. Now let's dig into this conversation where you're going to hear about the impact of a war on a global company and how that reverberates throughout time and across people, and how DataArt has used what they call their people first principle to help them make decisions during really tough times. Let's dig in. All right, Alexei, tell us about your hot mess, please.
On February 24th, 2022, I found myself as one of the leaders of a company that employed several thousand people in both Ukraine and Russia, in addition to about 20 other countries.
Okay.
And that morning, or early morning, the two countries were at war. To be more precise, Russia attacked Ukraine, launched full-scale invasion, and all of a sudden, although we had an inkling that something was going on, because for those following the news, Russian army was massing on the border of Ukraine, but no one really believed that there would be a war or a full-scale invasion, as it were. And bombs started to go off. Ukrainians were under attack, and this was a very hot mess. First and foremost, for humans, for people who were in Ukraine, a small portion of whom were employed by my company, and secondary, it was a mess for the business because the two of our largest locations, two of our largest places of employment were at war. Our clients for whom work was being delivered were all scary because all of a sudden this is from a relatively safe neighborhood and of the world, it became a very unsafe place to do business with no certainty that things would even continue. Russia very quickly came under a pretty serious set of sanctions. So working with Russia was quickly becoming impossible. So I do think that qualifies as a mess. And now with the passage of time, of course, it's a little bit easier to think about it as a business mess because our very existence as a company was under threat. But first and foremost, thousands, potentially millions of Ukrainian lives, but there's certainly thousands of our employees' lives were in danger. So it was a human mess.
Oh my gosh. Yes. And I know that anytime someone starts an episode with a specific date, there's usually something heart-wrenching involved because those are just days that you don't ever forget because you had colleagues whose lives were lost and at stake, and then so much uncertainty just goes up in the air and so much of it was out of your control.
Exactly. I do remember that date very well. In fact, it was late at night for us. It was early morning for Ukraine, but it was late at night the previous night for us. And we have in the company, we have this so-called ERT channel, emergency response team, which any well-established company would have a version of that to communicate to make decisions quickly in case of various emergencies. Sometimes we had to activate that for COVID when it was at its peak and some other sort of local emergencies. But this is where several dozen of key executives in the company are part of that channel. And I remember very well the very late night on February 23rd, first messages on that channel where people actually in Ukraine started to write, "We're hearing explosions," or "The war has started." So you're right, you don't forget that date. And the next several days after that, several weeks actually, were a blur of a whole bunch of decisions to be made, a whole bunch of them tactical, some very strategic, such as whether or not we were going to able to continue our business in Russia. We quickly decided that not. We're going to exit that business, to decide on the degree of our commitment to Ukraine and the investments we're going to make, and so on and so forth. We're happy to talk about all of those decisions, big and small, that had to be made in the weeks after the invasion started.
Yes. So, just the next 24, 48 hours, what were some of those decisions that you and your team had to make?
So before we talk about the decisions, maybe I should set some context for those decisions by describing our business. We're a technology services business. Our business, we develop software for about 400 clients in the US, UK, Germany, and a few other places. And we utilize teams globally in Ukraine and prior to war, Russia, but also throughout Europe, Latin America, here in the US, and so on and so forth. And for most of our clients, teams are distributed, meaning there could be, a team of 5, or it could be a team of 100, but it usually consists of team members from different places. You could have 3 people in Argentina, 5 people in Ukraine, 20 people in Poland, 7 people in Armenia, or any combination thereof. And so like I said before, the very existence of the business, whether we are able to continue as a going concern, whether we're able to continue to deliver on our projects for clients was in question. So obviously, when the war started, the first set of decisions was humanitarian. What do we do to help people? Do we help them move to safer parts of Ukraine? Are we able to offer those who are willing to leave the country, to what extent are we able to support them financially, logistically, in terms of keeping up the workplace, and so on? How are we going to communicate to clients? Whether we are able to continue work, and what are the areas in which work is interrupted, and when, if at all, it can recover. So the first few days are really a blur of a small stream of tactical decisions. This area is literally a hot area of the war right now. Therefore, work delivery cannot continue from there. We focus on humanitarian aspects of it. Other parts of our operations are less affected. Can they pick up some of the work to help cover for those who have to flee or fight for their family's safety, and so on? So it's I think it would be naive, maybe a misstatement to say that we're making strategic decisions in the first 48 hours. It was a blur of all stuff. And then with the passage of time over the next few weeks, you realize that those small decisions amount to something bigger. There are patterns that collectively create bigger decisions. And I can give you a few examples. So because we're a very distributed company, we employ about 6,000 people, but they're spread across about 30 countries. It's in the very nature of our operations to trust people on the ground to make decisions having to do with people in that geography, financial decisions, employment, hiring, firing, logistical support, the way their payroll is paid, and so on and so forth. That distributed model of decision making helped us a great deal. So people in Ukraine, our regional leaders in Ukraine, and we had 6 offices in Ukraine prior to war. So these 6 individuals and their teams were empowered to make local decisions, because we didn't have this sort of hierarchical top-down command and control decision making structure. We very quickly said, these types of decisions, they're on you guys. We'll support you whatever you decide, whether it means continuing operations or shutting the office down, whether it means hiring buses to ferry people away from the dangerous zones, whatever it was. Trusting people on the ground was one of the fundamental principles. So it wasn't a decision we made. It was a decision to set up the company this way that allowed people on the ground to make those day-to-day decisions.
Amazing.
The second group of decisions, if you will, was about money. It's a cliche to say that in business, survival is about cash. You've got to have money to pay payroll, to invest in new capacity, to cover any operational challenges. So, and we were lucky, we were in the good financial position. So we very quickly determined at a high level the amount of money we're willing to spend on humanitarian aspect, on providing direct help. For example, each person relocated from Ukraine to another place get a financial stipend that they were free to spend their own way, whether it's transportation for their families or equipment or just money for day-to-day. So all of that amounted to certain financial limits. And again, we said this is the sort of the umbrella amount. Within that amount, local leaders are free to spend however they see. So that sped up things quite dramatically. If we had to decide on every individual case somewhere in the management, those decisions would have taken much longer, and that was critical. So money is second, and third was communications, because explaining both to our people what's our position with regards to war and to our clients was critical. And I'm happy to talk about that separately. I think communications deserve sort of a special conversation.
Yes. Oh my gosh. So a couple of points I just want to highlight there. Mm-hmm. And I'm just taking notes, as you've been sharing this situation. As you mentioned, in the first 48 hours, it was really hard to make strategic decisions. You just make very tactical decisions based on the information that's coming at you. And a part of my career when I worked in the nonprofit world, I did a little bit of disaster recovery, and enough to learn about the patterns and the systems that exist in disaster recovery. And the exact same thinking applies to global pandemic response. It applies to continuity planning. It applies to war response. And in particular, we did disaster recovery after Hurricane Katrina, some local floods, some local tornadoes, that kind of stuff. And you're right. People come in the first hour, and they're like, well, what's the long range plan? You can't develop a long range plan when you're still in that crisis mode. And for some crises, it's 24 hours. Sometimes it's 24 weeks. Sometimes it's 24 days. You don't know until you see the patterns starting to emerge about this particular incident that you can connect the dots about this particular disaster before you can start making more strategic decisions. Maybe not even long-term decisions, but strategic decisions, because the patterns are emerging. And what I've learned, and you just reinforced this for me, every disaster has a series of patterns. The reason that the world could respond to a global pandemic in the way that it did, specifically COVID-19, is because it's responded to other global pandemics that weren't quite at this scale, but they had lessons to learn. And that's the same way that we have to think about how technology evolves. It's not like there's some new technology that's just going to beam itself out of outer space and we'll have no idea what to do with it. It's an evolution of things that we've done before. And I think people really they can lose their minds about what to do in a crisis because they forget, I've been through something like this before. It's not the exact same thing, but I can use that thinking pattern in this new, really hard scenario. And I find it helps ground people. It helps them kind of just settle down a little bit. So you can be like, okay, what are some level-headed decisions we can make based on what's really important to us? And in this case, obviously, the humanitarian perspective was forefront in your mind because of your value of people first and the way you've built your culture over the years and the decades you've been in business. That was a grounding anchor for you all during these initial days and weeks and months.
For sure. It's interesting that you've mentioned COVID-19 pandemic right now. And one of the side effects from the pandemic was interestingly helpful for us in dealing with the aftermath of the war, because prior to COVID-19, we had 17 offices in 12 countries or something, and we really had people concentrated in the offices. Pandemic forced work from home. We had to upgrade our infrastructure and security systems so anyone with a laptop can go and work safely and securely, compliantly from wherever.
Yep.
So in the war, when those 6 large offices that we operated in Ukraine suddenly became unsafe and not operational, it was okay when people were moving. Hundreds of people were on the road every day. Many of them were still able to continue to work simply because of all this infrastructure put together because of COVID. So
Yes.
I'm not generally grateful for COVID for anything. I think it was a huge blow to humanity. But in this sense, it did improve our preparedness and our business continuity, hardened our position, if you will, in order to be able to handle this. If COVID didn't happen and the war happened, I don't know, we would have been in a worse shape for sure.
Yes. Oh, and it feels unempathetic to say that, but folks who can grow and are resilient, companies who can grow and are resilient, are able to take the amazing lessons that come out of really hard times. That's just a fact of the human condition.
One of the big lessons to me from this was the importance of communications, internal and external. And sometimes in business, communications seems sort of rah, this is the beautiful future we're building, and this is how we're creating value, and all of that. All of that is important, but sometimes communications about principles and where you stand are extremely important. So for me, this brings back memories that, speaking of those decisions or messages we had to send out in the first 48 hours since the war started. So again, to set the context, at the moment the war started, we employed about 2,700 people in Ukraine, about 1,600 people in Russia. One of the operating principles of DataArt as a company has always been people first. We made decisions keeping in mind people's priorities, not necessarily immediate profit. We try to take into account their lives, their personal journeys, their families, and so on and so forth. So you've got people here and people there. Like you can no longer say people first, because which people? The 2 people are at war. And so there was this huge demand internally for us as leaders and among our employees to define clearly where do we stand. So putting out a statement and being clear that we condemn the war, we're absolutely against Russia's aggression. There's no way, even though we had operations in Russia, there's no way we can excuse it or explain it. Was extremely important, and that is something we had to say clearly, loudly, internally and externally, literally in the first hours of the war. Following that, in the next, I think was about 10 days, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, we had to make a decision to shut down our Russia operation, which was painful because we were in the country for 20 plus years. We employed 1,600 people there, but we had said we're no longer able to continue operations in that country. We're making a commitment to Ukraine and continue operations there, but Russia business will have to shut down. The actual process of shutting down a business where you have multiple offices, a couple thousand employees, legal entities, and so on, that took many months. But decision that it will have to happen had to be made fairly quickly. And explaining those decisions both to people in Ukraine who demanded our clarity on that, because for most of them, continuing to work in a company that had operations in Russia was just impossible. For them, it was a fundamental, as black and white as it gets. But also explaining them to people in Russia, many of whom said, we don't support the war. We had nothing to do with the war. Why do we have to lose our jobs?
Yes.
But we had to explain why, and many of them were pointing, what about people first? We're people too. So how do you make that choice? And then finally to clients, because 1,600 people in Russia meant delivery to hundreds of clients, and those operations were going to have to be affected, and explaining our decision to clients, some of whom welcomed it and some of whom not so much, I have to say, and what it meant and how we're going to backfill and how we're going to support them. All of those communication flows were and how you explain those decisions were equally important, maybe more so than making decisions themselves. I frequently think about it, and in discussing with my colleagues and sometimes clients who ask me, well, how did you make the decision to exit business in Russia? I again and again come to this understanding that making that decision was maybe not simple, maybe not easy, but it was clear. Like, it was very clear the right and wrong. So making decision about what follows from that is not a difficult decision. Actually executing that decision is hard.
Yes.
Explaining it to clients and people who are affected, that is hard work, and that took a long time. But making decisions are sometimes, I think, in sort of American corporate culture, the decision makers are glorified. Oh, you made this strategic decision, the tough choice and whatever. And I think sometimes maybe it's right, but sometimes it's a little bit of a lie, because making decisions is easy in some cases. Following through on those decisions, that's hard, and that's what hundreds and potentially thousands of people have to deal with, not just the proverbial decision makers.
Yes. Oh my gosh, such an impactful statement to make. I couldn't agree more. So I want to ask you one more question about this hot mess, this situation as Data Art was going through it, and as you were going through it, and then we'll take a quick commercial break and we'll come back and talk about, okay, how is life different, better, stronger at Data Art, because you all went through this together. And, thinking through the tactical decisions, the strategic decisions, the really hard decisions, and then having to execute them. Between you and your senior leadership team and those on the ground, what have you all come to see about what is so important about the people first mantra at Data Art that you didn't know going into February 2022?
Working in a multicultural company with operations in many places, with people from different backgrounds, the people first mantra is always tested. And it always is stretched, because people are different, and what they want, depending on their life circumstances, their culture, their history, their needs and wants, it's different. And it's easier, not easy, but easier to discuss people first on an individual level. You're a person. I can have an intelligent conversation. I can do my best to understand what you want as an individual. And that's much easier to do than when you have a group of individuals assembled into teams, assembled into regional teams, assembled into different functions in the company, and so on and so forth. So I think, to answer your question, people first is one of those things that are far easier said than done. And being honest with ourselves about the limits of it was an important takeaway. It remains to this day one of the guiding principles of Data Art, but we're a little bit more clear-eyed about the limits of it all. And claiming that you're people first does not absolve you of having to make some tough choices that you have to make, because your very existence of the company and employment of thousands of people is potentially at risk. I think people first extends also beyond employees only. Your clients are people too, even though they're corporate entities for the most part, who pay you out of their corporate budgets. And this has less to do with the war, although many of our clients most of our clients, in fact, I have to express sincere thanks, because they behaved really as good human beings. And sometimes they said, it's okay, we can wait with this project or that project, or we will, help fund this particular team extra more than they had to pay, because we understand what they're going through. So they're being very human and humane in their reaction to it all. But for us, trying to understand why they do certain things, why they launch certain projects, why they decide to engage with a company such as ourselves. It's not just about their corporate priorities. It's also about their needs and wants and biases as human beings. And combining these, your needs as employees, shareholders, clients, people in different geographies, it's a messy conversation every single time. So if there's any takeaway, is anyone who thinks they can develop simple rules to follow is probably naive or crazy or inexperienced and what have you. So we've resigned to live with this, and we've resigned to this being a difficult conversation every single time. So far, it's holding up, although not without cracks.
It's holding up that it will remain difficult. Sounds about right.
Well, we're certainly not giving up on people first as
Yes.
a principle, but we're
Yeah.
not as naive about how powerful it can be as the decision-making sort of foundation.
Gotcha. All right. Well, let's take a quick break and let's come back and we'll keep talking about the tension that is held when you're committed not only to people first, but also running a strong culture and a strong company. All right. Well, we take a quick break from this amazing conversation today. I want to share with you a new tool that I have for you. I think that there's a myth in our workplaces. Well, let me say this. I know there's a myth in our workplaces that meetings have to suck, and I don't believe that whatsoever. By all accounts, our time in meetings have doubled, if not more, since the start of the pandemic. And this time with your colleagues should not be a waste of time. It should be the most valuable. So if you're looking for more resources to lead meetings that are productive, powerful, impactful, and have everyone participating, get over to my website at stephaniecrevens.com/lead kick-ass meetings and get some new tools so that when you leave a meeting with your colleagues, you're not left going, what the actual F was that? You're going, yes, we're going to take on the world together. Let's get this done, because it was an unbelievably powerful meeting. Those tools are out there for you, my friends, and they're on my website today, stephaniecrevens.com/lead kick-ass meetings. Now, let's get back into that conversation. All right. So, Alexei, Data Art has committed to holding this tension so that you can continue to hold this people first mentality. And over the years, I'm guessing you all kind of thought it was simple, and two really, really tough scenarios have made it not so simple. Since going through the transitions with the war in Ukraine and taking the stance and communicating and balancing first what people need, but then also the realities of running a business, what are ways that you've seen that struggle with people first really pay off for the company?
I think it would be cliche, but a correct cliche to say that ultimately, despite all the difficulty and the pain, it does improve loyalty. It doesn't work for everyone, so I would be lying if I said that our loyalty is absolute and we never lose people. Of course we do, but I think our people retention rate is quite high. It's higher than many of our peers, maybe most of our peers. And it also creates this commitment that when you're faced with a difficult situation, a client milestone, a delivery, you can ask your people for more. You treat them well. You understand that they're humans with their own lives and not just cogs in the machine who clock in 8 hours a day. And hopefully they appreciate this attitude from the companies that are willing to go an extra mile when the situation demands it. That's a very practical outcome of this. But it would be wrong to say that we chose people first as it was one of our guiding principles for practical reasons. I think the founding group, I'm one of the group of founders of the companies, by no means the only one. I think we all wanted to work in a company and create something that we would match with us. Maybe this is one of the reasons we don't work for another firm, and we chose to build this one, although this may not be the most pleasant or profitable way to spend our lives. But I think it gives us all great satisfaction of not being in a constant conflict. We live in the company the way we live outside of it. And I think it's important for balance in life and for feeling at peace. And so it's rewarding to know that position, that value was compatible with thousands of people who want to live similarly, and maybe inspiring to some people who want to make a career in a place like this.
Yes.
And funny enough, this when we started the company, we didn't formulate that this is how the company will operate. It's just natural. This is what we wanted to be like. It didn't seem particularly special or unique. And it was only years later, 10, 15 years after the company was started, that we realized, oh, this is actually different. The companies generally and companies in our sector in particular are usually organized differently. They usually operate based out of a different set of principles. And, some of them are very, very successful, highly profitable, and maybe some of their operations we could copy, but we don't, because that's different foundation. So this is a little bit of a post factum rationalization, but this being in peace with how the company operates is extremely important, and I think makes it sustainable for the future. It's less dependent on individual managers. It's less cynical in its decision making.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's more efficient. Sometimes it's less efficient than the others. But it's certainly more sustainable, and I think that's important for us.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And to think about the possibilities because of the decisions that you made in 2020 and 2022, that data art can exist in 2082 and 2092. Like, that to me sounds powerful, edifying. That's part of you and your other founders' legacies. That means something to the world and to the families that will be employed and served by you between now and then.
Well, it's funny you say it like this. We used to joke, and it was always only part joke. One of my partners, Mikhail, who lives in London now, used to say that we're not in a rush. I've done the math, and at the current rate of growth, we will be the largest company in the world in about 250 years. Yeah, we won't see it, but we all have children and grandchildren, and someone will see it, and that's okay. Why rush? Just the knowledge of it all should give us some reassurance. And I think while of course it was mostly joke, this not being in a rush is sometimes a necessary component in business. It's too much sometimes about making the new milestone, making money this year, extracting profit this year. Oftentimes it comes at the expense of long-term sustainability. Yes. We're a for-profit corporation. Of course we want to make money. Of course we want to grow today and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. But it's very important to balance it out. Extracting extra 2 percentage points in margin this year may have real world implications 5 years down the road, and always keeping both sides in mind is absolutely critical. And funny enough, people first helps us, because the choice, do you want to make money today or 5 years from now? It's a mechanical choice. How do you make it? Pocketbook is not always the easiest decision-making guide, but what's better for the people? You as a people, and your employees as a people, your client as a people, actually helps you make that choice.
Absolutely. Well, and I want to connect that to something earlier you said, because as part of your helping folks in Ukraine, they got cash stipends to do what they needed to do with their life at that time. And no company has an endless supply of cash, and cash is the thing that keeps us open, because we can make payroll not only 2 weeks from now, 2 months from now, 2 years from now, right? And companies just can't borrow cash to support things like this, because it costs the company its livelihood in a matter of months and years, right? What do you wish people knew that aren't yet in the C-suite about these types of decisions, where you would love to be able to help, but you don't have the endless cash to help in the way that you would love to as a human being? Like, there's a tension there that you always have to balance. What does it feel like to be in that tension?
As I mentioned before, we were fortunate to be in a fairly strong financial positions. We were always very conservatively managed. We were always consistently profitable. And we had the backing of our private equity investors, FTV Capital and others. And I'm very, very grateful to them. They behaved extremely honorable and was super supportive throughout. So we were lucky, because we did have cash, not an endless amount of cash. No one does,
Right.
and we certainly did it, but enough to make and follow through on some of those decisions on support and client commitments, backfilling our own investments, infrastructure rebuild, and so on. It was multi-million-dollar effort, of course. You're right to point out this tension that you don't have endless amount of cash, so everything everyone wants will not be able to fulfill.
Yes.
A couple things come to mind. First, I think as leaders of the company, you want to not just show, but actually be in the same boat. You don't want to be excessive with your spending. You don't want to be excessive with your compensation during those difficult times. When the situation returns to normal, you can get things back to normal. The line between normal operations and abuse is not always financial abuse, not always visible. So we always wanted to be very, very careful by behaving and being true to our word about implementing and subjecting ourselves to austerity measures when and if they are required. So, for example, obviously, this war happened late February 2022 started. So one of the first decisions was, this is typically in corporations, typically bonus season. Management get bonuses based on last year's result, just happened to be that time frame. So of course, all of that was suspended. We got back to those payments many months later when the situation stabilized somewhat. But of course, even though results of last year were sort of done and dusted, none of those payments were being made. We also made a choice to be very clear with our people about financial limits. So whatever overall financial commitments we made, we said this is the money. This is what it means on individual level, on regional level. So everyone knew that this is not sort of some kind guy or gal sitting in the office and issuing money. That this is the overall commitment that the board has authorized, and we're operating within that commitment. We were clear about the actual amounts. The people understand the economic reality they're working with. So you don't have to say simple things like the company doesn't have endless amount of money. People get that. People are intelligent and educated, and that much is obvious. But you have to translate what it means for them. So sometimes you just have to speak a different language, translate it to the words that strike close to home. Like, for example, I've been in a leadership group of the company for many, many years, but I'm not a finance professional. So it's still difficult for me to read a balance sheet. And when our financial department starts to speak in terms of language that is clear for them, it's not easy for me. And similarly, when I'm discussing with our teams, these overall financial commitments, I have to translate what it means for them, what it means for the margin of the company. If our margin falls below certain threshold or indeed becomes negative, what kind of decisions it triggers for them, even though we may have financial reserves and so on. And that technique of speaking the language of your audience, I mean, it's obvious you have those situations every day, but it's particularly prominent when it comes to money, because money is a dry subject. Money is, in the society, we no longer use bags of cash. Money is, lines in Excel somewhere there, or numbers in the accounting software. So one of the techniques that I and many others at Data had to learn is explaining what money means for an individual client, an individual person, and groups of people. And it continues to be not an easy subject. I'm continuing to learn that.
Oh, I love that. So what does money mean, Alexei?
In our business, there is about 400 projects going on at any point in time. And for each client, we have certain obligations to deliver. A client pays us. And we have a fairly sophisticated mechanism of calculating economics of each individual client relationship. What we're spending, what we're earning, what's the margin profile, how it's changing over time, and so on. And so over time, we worked out a way to explain to our teams and to our clients that a certain economic profile of the client relationship, so a certain account makes sense, some they don't. And so we are being very clear with people about how do we attribute certain expenses to an individual client account, how the gross margin, what we call contribution margin, how is that calculated, and so on. So for example, when I take a business trip to see a client, that money, my plane ticket and my car rental and whatnot, is being attributed to that client account in a certain way.
Yep.
And so each employee's salary is attributable to a client account. So we were able over time to translate this dry subject of money into sort of human understandable statements about account economics. In addition to that, company has certain reserves, and those reserves are spent on various programs, sometimes just to keep the lights open, to sustain operations. Sometimes those are investments and so on. So once you put it in those different categories, this is account money, this is business operations money, these are reserves for business continuity, those are investments we're making, and so on. The different buckets of money, and these bucket touches you as an employee in this function. This money doesn't touch you because you have nothing to do with those accounts. So we're trying to bring it to specific category, explain the limits on each bucket and the impact on an individual project or a function, and so on. They're also, without getting too technical, they're also compensation mechanism. People want to make more money, and sometimes they need to understand that, from their work and their team, there's certain financial inflows that either allows us or does not allow us to pay them more in whatever form that is. Being honest about those mechanisms helps those conversations. All of it, I think, sort of goes back to, in some ways, to the people first principle, because one of the first components of the people first principle is being open and honest with your people. This is what's going on, including with money. So that helps a lot. All of this predates the war, but it helped us build this employee loyalty and being transparent about the financial impact of the decisions we made in the aftermath of the war, because we had this foundation of breaking down money to sort of human language already in place.
Yes. Yeah, that type of transparency builds trust and helps people understand the limits. That's one of the things that's striking me about this conversation is a lot of good leaders explain what's possible, which we need. And I think great leaders can also explain the limits of what's not possible, or what resources don't exist, or what decisions aren't on the table, because that creates a better context for people to do the work in.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not so easy to strike the balance between excessive information. Some people will say, I do this job, I only care about this. Why are you telling me how the company works financially, and what are all of the other investments you're making, and la la la. And yeah, sometimes it's PMI, too much information for people, but that's the choice. That's the choice we make. We make much of that information available for those who are willing to listen. If you don't want to listen, of course, we can't force you, but it helps. It helps make it. There are limits, of course. Not all financial laundries should be available to everyone. So,
of course.
Of course, we have to draw the line somewhere, but by and large, we try to err on the side of more transparency.
Yes. All right. One last question, and I'll let you get back to changing your part of the world here. I think about you and your fellow leadership team and the local folks on the ground in Russia and Ukraine in February of 2022. God forbid something like this ever happens in another part of the world, right? Like, you're going to have other parts of your company that are mostly unaffected, right? And in Americans, we live in a very privileged world because we are rarely physically attacked we've only been one time physically attacked that we know of, from a foreign terrorist or foreign entity, right? But what do you wish that your employees who are sitting in a geographic area, that they read about it and hopefully their hearts go out to people, but really their lives are fairly unimpacted, right? What do you wish that they knew about what it means to be in your seat during times like these, in a way that they can contribute to the company?
It's interesting because I want to start my comment by saying that there's no such place and no such individual who is largely unaffected. Even in our
Agreed.
company,
Agreed.
in our company, you know, it would be a huge mistake of me not to acknowledge what people who were not in Russia and Ukraine did to help people and the company survive and ultimately prosper. I'll give you a few examples. Obviously, Poland is just across the border from Ukraine, and our folks in Poland, we had sizable operations in the country, an enormous amount of work. People who accepting people from Ukraine, supporting them, taking over some of the infrastructure, supplying humanitarian goods across the border in the opposite direction. It was, I mean, hundreds of people left Ukraine, needed to be somewhere, and there by and large were in Poland, and the way our people there and the broader Polish population have received them, it's nothing short of admirable. So Poland was hugely affected. Another example, Armenia. Armenia was one of the places that Russian citizens could arrive in, did not have problems with visa and finding local employment and so on. And when we decided that our business in Russia would have to end, about half of the people who were previously employed at Datar decided to move and stay with the company in different directions. And the lion's share of those people ended up in Armenia and a few other countries. And Armenia in particular had to do enormous amount of work to receive them, help them settle, find housing, register for employment, change their payroll, acclimate to local cultural and way of living. Hundreds and hundreds of people were received, and the hospitality and generosity that people in Armenia and other countries like Kazakhstan, eventually Bulgaria, Germany, Romania, Cyprus, all of the countries where we had Georgia, where we have operations, that's been enormous. And even places further away, like folks in Argentina and other countries in Latin America that were very far geographically from the war, they had to put in extra shifts because folks in Ukraine could not work for a while. We'll help out. How can we help? So
amazing.
We live in a world where wars may be local, but the impact is global, and we very much felt it. And so there was no such place or a person in the company that was unaffected. And I'm genuinely and honestly really grateful for everyone, whether they are in Ukraine or very far from Ukraine.
Yeah.
And so going back to your question, certainly hope that nothing like this will ever happen again. But thinking about it makes me hope that multinational corporations, we're not a giant company, we're a large company, but not a giant company, but in some ways they have an important social function. They provide this connectivity between countries that surpasses national borders, and that build teams and loyalty and friendly relations between peoples, sometimes maybe more effectively than all the government efforts and the cultural exchanges and so on and so forth. Yeah. By giving teams joint projects to work on some shared minds, forcing them to accept each other's cultural differences. And so I think that, you know, capitalism system and the open borders and the open economy that does have its issues and does seem unfair at times, does a whole lot of good in terms of building this cross-cultural, cross-regional, cross-country relationships, which makes the whole system a lot more resilient. And I think even though we were heavily impacted by the war, we survived and sustained, and now we're growing again. I think our contribution to the world, if you will, is making the whole system more resilient because of this shared mind space between the people. At the risk of being sort of too exultant about it, but I really think that's an important takeaway from this whole thing.
Oh my gosh, that's beautiful. And, you know, as you described that, I was realizing, like, man, did I ask that question from a very American perspective? Because I do feel like Americans are, I agree with you, we're all connected, like, in all the ways that, you know, spiritually, economically, business-wise, service-wise, we're connected in all the ways around the globe. I feel like Americans, we feel like we're safe and largely unaffected from a lot of that because we're I don't know what word I want to use, isolated, protected in a lot of ways that other countries are not. And I think it's easier for Americans to kind of sit here and say, I'm not trying to do political commentary, but we sit here and like, we can say with a high degree of certainty, like, we probably won't be bombed, in the middle of America here in Indiana where I'm at. And we have a sense of safety that I think allows us to disconnect in a way that is not helpful.
Well, I guess geographically and politically that is true, but I do want to mention the very human reactions that many of our clients here in the States and partners expressed, and they were very, very generous. I had dozens of messages from clients and suppliers to us here in the state who said, well, if you have folks moving in from Europe, they can stay at my house. Literally no reason to do that, and coming out of the blue, very generous. I've had clients who in other circumstances would be sort of hardcore, cynical, very money driven American corporations send me messages, said, this month I know your teams couldn't work, we'll still pay.
Wow.
We never asked them for it. We gratefully received it, but they had no business reason to do that. So
amazing.
Despite this sense of protection from physical danger that I think many folks in America hear, the human spirit very much lives on, and I'm very, very, very grateful to our clients and partners here in this country for that.
Oh, I love to hear that. That's fabulous. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation today. I learned a lot, but I was just so inspired by what is possible through businesses and leaders like you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
My friend, I don't know about you, but I had immense joy listening to Alexei's empathy and thought process of how to work through something really, really tough with his entire company. And clearly what they were able to accomplish from the impacts of the war in Ukraine, those foundations were being built years and decades before they got to the war. And that's what I hope that you'll begin to take away from what you're learning on this podcast too, is that the foundations that you build through a strong culture, regardless of what your values are, when you use those values consistently, when things get really, really tough, people will band together and step up and serve the company and serve each other because of the strength of the culture. And so I challenge each of you listening in to find ways to strengthen your culture using your values from wherever you are today, so that when the next crisis hits, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, your culture is stronger and more ready and more resilient because of that. And I just want to share with you quickly my top takeaways, and I'd love to hear yours wherever you're listening in from Alexei's leadership. We talked so much about the tension of making decisions from the perspective of people first. Prior to the war in Ukraine, people first seemed really straightforward, right? We choose our humans first. And sometimes, humans might be our employees over our clients, but we choose our people first. And the war really, really battle tested that. And they came to learn, and I hope you heard this through the conversation, that one, people first does not equal loyalty at all costs, right? Those are two different things. But then the second is when you have a really strongly held value, there will always be tension in that value that's created that forces you to make tough decisions. That is true for any strongly held value. So I think sometimes we think, oh, well, we have our value, so answers will become crystal clear if we use that value or set of values or set of criteria to make decisions. No, the tension never goes away, but it does give you a place of confidence and integrity from which you can make decisions and your team can make decisions. So that's part of what helps us as leaders sleep at night, is that sense of integrity. But we also have to acknowledge that while we'll have integrity, we'll still have tension whenever we make the hard decisions. And with the hard decisions, as Alexei said, we can overestimate the ease of decision making when we think, oh, we made the decision. No, it's about executing the decision. The hard part is executing the decision. That's where a second oomph of bravery has to be kicked in is when we go to make good on that decision. You have to, again, be in integrity with yourself and your values to hold through and push through on that action taking for the decision. That's really the part that takes tenacity and resilience. The third thing that I'll leave you with from this conversation that stuck with me, and I hope sticks with you as well, is we don't always have to be in such a rush. Sometimes having an eye on the long game, sometimes taking a deep breath and thinking about how will this pay off in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, or as Martha Beck's decision-making criteria is, how will this matter in 10 minutes, 10 days, 10 months, or 10 years? Looking through it through those longer time frames sometimes can help us make better decisions. Again, more aligned with our values, that would be great. More aligned with sustainability, that would be awesome. But this fast, frantic pace that we often get ourselves wrapped up into in our American work culture is not sustainable. It comes with huge, huge costs, energy, mental wellness, cash, sometimes poor decision making. So I just invite you today, if you haven't already, take a really deep breath and make some decisions that have an eye on the long game, the end game, not just what's most important or the fire that needs put out right now. All right, my friend, wherever you're listening in, thank you for being here. And if you got value out of this episode, if you would share it with another pro troublemaker, I would be unbelievably grateful. I'll see you soon.